a village priest who vanished without a trace in 1941. 82 years of silence. And then, beneath the stone altar where he once prayed, his bones tell a story more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. This is the darkest secret ever buried in an American church, and what was found beneath that altar will change everything you thought you knew about World War II. It was October 15th, 1941, 2 months before Pearl Harbor would drag America into the Second World War. The small village of Ashford, nestled in the mountains of Vermont, was home to barely 300 souls. Most were farmers, loggers, people who had lived there for generations, people who knew every face, every name, every secret, or so they thought. At the heart of this tight-knit community stood St. Michael's Church, a modest stone building erected in 1873 by Irish immigrants who had settled in the area. And serving that church was Father Thomas O'Brien, a 47-year-old priest who had arrived in Ashford 5 years earlier, in 1936, sent by the Diocese of Burlington to minister to this remote mountain community. Father O'Brien was beloved by everyone in Ashford. He was a tall man, 6 feet 2 inches, with greying hair, kind blue eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and a gentle voice that could calm even the most troubled soul. He visited the sick, comforted the dying, baptized babies, married young couples, buried the dead. He taught catechism to the children every Sunday after Mass. He organized food drives for families struggling through the Great Depression. He was more than just a priest. He was a friend, a counselor, a pillar of the community. People trusted him with their deepest secrets, their darkest fears, their most fervent prayers. He was a man of God, dedicated to his flock, seemingly without a care in the world beyond the spiritual welfare of his parishioners. But Father O'Brien carried secrets of his own, secrets that would remain buried for 82 years. On the morning of October 15th, 1941, Father O'Brien said his usual 6 o'clock Mass. There were only 7 people in attendance that morning, as was typical for a weekday service. Mary Sullivan, an elderly widow who attended daily Mass without fail. John and Elizabeth McCarthy, a farming couple in their 50s. Young Robert Chen, a Chinese immigrant who had converted to Catholicism and worked at the local lumber mill. The Kowalski sisters, Anna and Helena, Polish immigrants who ran the village's only bakery. And Thomas Brennan, the church's caretaker and bell ringer, a simple man in his 30s who lived in a small cottage behind the church. They all remembered that Mass clearly. Father O'Brien seemed perfectly normal. He delivered his homily about faith in difficult times. He blessed the congregation. He gave communion. Nothing seemed unusual. Nothing suggested that this would be the last time anyone would see Father Thomas O'Brien alive. After Mass, Father O'Brien returned to the rectory, the small house adjacent to the church where he lived alone. Mary Sullivan saw him enter around 7:15 in the morning. She waved to him from across the street. He waved back, smiling. That was the last confirmed sighting of Father O'Brien. At noon, when he didn't appear for his usual lunch at the rectory, Thomas Brennan knocked on the door. No answer. He knocked again. Still nothing. Brennan tried the door. It was unlocked. He entered, calling out for Father O'Brien. The rectory was empty. The breakfast dishes were washed and put away. The bed was made. Everything was neat and orderly, exactly as Father O'Brien always kept it. But the priest was nowhere to be found. Brennan checked the church. Empty. He checked the cemetery behind the church. Empty. He walked through the village, asking if anyone had seen Father O'Brien. No one had. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, people were starting to worry. It wasn't like Father O'Brien to disappear without telling anyone. He had responsibilities. He had evening prayers to lead. He had a meeting scheduled with the bishop's representative who was visiting from Burlington. By 6 o'clock, when Father O'Brien still hadn't appeared, the village constable, a man named Patrick Murphy, was called. Murphy was a practical man, a former logger who had taken the constable position after losing 3 fingers in a sawmill accident. He organized a search party. 20 men combed through the village, the surrounding woods, the mountain trails. They searched until darkness made it impossible to continue. They found nothing, no trace of Father O'Brien, no footprints leading away from the village, no signs of a struggle, nothing. The search continued the next day and the day after that. The state police were called in. Detectives from Burlington arrived. They interviewed everyone in the village. They searched Father O'Brien's rectory thoroughly, looking for clues. They found his wallet with $43 inside. They found his coat hanging on the rack. They found his Bible on his bedside table, bookmarked at the Gospel of John. Everything suggested that Father O'Brien had intended to return, but he never did. The detectives developed several theories. Perhaps he had suffered a medical emergency, a heart attack or stroke, and had wandered into the woods in a confused state. But if that were true, they should have found his body. The woods around Ashford weren't that vast. Perhaps he had been attacked by a wild animal, a bear or mountain lion. But there was no blood, no torn clothing, no evidence of violence. Perhaps he had simply decided to leave, to abandon his vocation and start a new life somewhere else. But why would he leave his money, his coat, his personal belongings? And why would a man so devoted to his faith and his community suddenly abandon everything without a word? The most disturbing theory came from Detective Harold Chambers, a seasoned investigator from Burlington who had worked dozens of missing persons cases. Chambers believed that Father O'Brien had been murdered. But by whom? And why? And most importantly, where was the body? Chambers interviewed every person in Ashford, looking for anyone who might have had a motive to harm the priest. He found nothing. Everyone loved Father O'Brien. No one had any reason to want him dead, or so they claimed. Chambers wasn't satisfied. In his experience, everyone had secrets. Everyone had motives. It was just a matter of digging deep enough to find them. He focused his investigation on the church itself. He questioned Thomas Brennan extensively about his relationship with Father O'Brien. Brennan was a simple man, perhaps even slightly slow-witted, but he seemed genuinely devastated by the priest's disappearance. He had worked for Father O'Brien for 5 years, maintaining the church grounds, ringing the bells, helping with various tasks. He insisted that Father O'Brien had been kind to him, had treated him with respect, when others in the village mocked him for his limited intelligence. Chambers also investigated the church's finances. Perhaps Father O'Brien had been embezzling money. Perhaps someone had discovered this and confronted him. But the church's books were impeccable. Every penny was accounted for. Father O'Brien had been scrupulously honest in his financial dealings. As weeks turned into months, the investigation stalled. There were simply no leads, no evidence, no witnesses. Father O'Brien had vanished as completely as if he had been spirited away by supernatural forces. The Diocese of Burlington sent a replacement priest, Father Michael Donnelly, a younger man in his 30s, who tried his best to fill the void left by Father O'Brien. But the people of Ashford never forgot their missing priest. They prayed for him every Sunday. They hoped that somehow, someday, he would return, or that they would at least learn what had happened to him. Then on December 7th, 1941, less than 2 months after Father O'Brien's disappearance, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. America was plunged into World War II. Suddenly, the disappearance of a small-town priest seemed less important. Young men from Ashford enlisted in the military, families worried about sons and husbands fighting overseas. The war consumed everyone's attention. Detective Chambers was called back to Burlington to work on cases related to the war effort, investigating potential saboteurs and black market operations. The search for Father O'Brien was quietly shelved. The case remained officially open, but no one was actively working on it anymore. Years passed. The war ended in 1945. The soldiers came home, some whole, some broken, some not at all. Life in Ashford slowly returned to normal. Father Donnelly continued to serve the community, and eventually people stopped talking about Father O'Brien. The older generation, those who had known him personally, gradually died off. By the 1960s, Most of the people who remembered Father O'Brien were gone. By the 1980s, he was just a footnote in the church's history, a curious mystery that occasionally came up in conversation but held no real significance for the younger generations. The case of the vanished priest became a local legend, a ghost story that parents told their children on dark winter nights. But someone knew. Someone had always known what happened to Father Thomas O'Brien, and that someone had kept the secret for 82 years, a secret buried beneath the stone altar of St. Michael's Church. In the spring of 2023, the Diocese of Burlington decided that St. Michael's Church needed major renovations. The building was 150 years old. The roof leaked. The foundation had cracks. The electrical system was outdated and potentially dangerous. The diocese allocated funds for a complete restoration. A construction company from Burlington Morrison & Sons was hired to do the work. The project manager was a man named David Morrison, third-generation owner of the family business, a meticulous professional who took pride in preserving historic buildings. The renovation began in May 2023. The first phase involved repairing the foundation. This required excavating around the perimeter of the church and, in some areas, digging beneath the floor inside the church itself. On June 12, 2023, a crew was working inside the church, carefully removing the stone tiles that formed the floor of the sanctuary. They were working near the altar, the most sacred part of the church, where the priest celebrated Mass. The altar itself was a massive piece of carved stone weighing several tons that had been installed when the church was built in 1873. To access the foundation beneath the altar, the crew needed to temporarily move it. Using hydraulic jacks and extreme care, they slowly lifted the altar. As it rose, one of the workers, a young man named Jake Peterson, noticed something in the dirt beneath where the altar had stood. "Hey, boss!" he called out to David Morrison. "There's something down here." Morrison came over and looked. There, partially exposed in the dirt, was what appeared to be a piece of fabric. Morrison knelt down and carefully brushed away some of the dirt. His heart began to race. Beneath the fabric, he could see bone, human bone. "Stop everything," Morrison said quietly. "Nobody touches anything. I'm calling the police." And within an hour, the church was swarming with police officers, forensic investigators, and representatives from the state medical examiner's office. The area beneath the altar was carefully excavated. What they found was a complete human skeleton, buried in a shallow grave approximately 3 feet deep. The skeleton was wrapped in what appeared to be a priest's black cassock, now rotted and decayed, but still recognizable. Near the skeleton, they found other objects. A pair of wire-rimmed glasses, a rosary with wooden beads, a small silver crucifix, and most significantly they found a ring, a priest's ring with an inscription inside, "Father Thomas O'Brien, ordained June 12, 1920. The news spread through Ashford like wildfire. After 82 years, Father O'Brien had been found. He had been there all along, buried beneath the altar where he had celebrated Mass, where he had consecrated the Eucharist, where he had prayed for his congregation. The discovery sent shockwaves through the community and beyond. Major news networks picked up the story. CNN, Fox News, MSNBC all sent reporters to Ashford. The New York Times ran a front-page story. "Missing priest found beneath church altar after 82 years. The case that had been forgotten for decades was suddenly the most talked-about mystery in America. The Vermont State Police reopened the investigation. The lead investigator was Detective Sarah Chen, a forensic specialist with 15 years of experience. Chen and her team had the skeleton transported to the State Forensic Laboratory for detailed analysis. The forensic anthropologist confirmed that the remains were those of a male, approximately 45 to 50 years old, at time of death. Height, approximately 6 feet 2 inches. The dental records, miraculously preserved in the church archives, confirmed the identity. These were definitely the remains of Father Thomas O'Brien, but how had he died? That was the crucial question. The forensic examination revealed the answer, and it was more horrifying than anyone had imagined. The skeleton showed clear evidence of trauma. The hyoid bone in the neck was fractured, a classic sign of strangulation. Several ribs were broken, suggesting that someone had knelt on Father O'Brien's chest while strangling him. There were also fractures to the skull, indicating that he had been struck on the head, possibly to subdue him before the strangulation. This was not an accident. This was not a medical emergency. This was murder, cold-blooded, premeditated murder. Someone had killed Father Thomas O'Brien and then buried him beneath the altar of his own church. But who and why? Detective Chen began the painstaking process of reviewing all the evidence from the original 1941 investigation. She read through hundreds of pages of witness statements, detective notes, and reports. She studied the layout of the church and the rectory. She tried to understand the logistics of how someone could have murdered a priest and buried him beneath a massive stone altar without anyone noticing. The altar weighed several tons. Moving it would have required significant effort and equipment. It wasn't something one person could do alone. It would have made noise. It would have taken time. How could someone have done this in a small village where everyone knew everyone else's business? Chen developed a theory. The murder must have happened at night, when the church was empty and the village was asleep. The killer, or killers, must have had access to the church. They must have had the tools and knowledge necessary to move the altar. And they must have had a powerful motive to kill a beloved priest and go to such extraordinary lengths to hide the body. Chen created a list of people who had the means and opportunity. At the top of that list was Thomas Brennan, the church caretaker. Brennan had keys to the church. He had access to tools. He knew the building intimately. He would have known how to move the altar. But Brennan had died in 1978, 45 years ago. There was no way to question him now. Chen decided to dig deeper into Brennan's background. She discovered something interesting. In 1939, 2 years before Father O'Brien's disappearance, Brennan had been briefly hospitalized at the Vermont State Hospital for the Insane. He had suffered what was described in the medical records as a nervous breakdown. He had been released after 3 months and had returned to his job at the church. Father O'Brien had personally vouched for him, insisting that Brennan was harmless and deserved a second chance. But what had caused that breakdown? The medical records were vague, citing religious delusions and paranoid ideation. Chen wondered if there was more to the story. She interviewed the few remaining people in Ashford who were old enough to remember the 1940s. One of them was Margaret Sullivan, 98 years old, the granddaughter of Mary Sullivan, who had attended Father O'Brien's last Mass. Margaret had been 16 in 1941. She remembered Father O'Brien clearly. He was a wonderful man, she said, her eyes misting with tears. Everyone loved him. His disappearance devastated the whole village. Chen asked about Thomas Brennan. Margaret's expression changed. Thomas was troubled, she said carefully. He was devoted to Father O'Brien, almost obsessively so. He followed him around like a puppy. Some people thought it was strange, but Father O'Brien was kind to him. He saw the good in everyone. Chen pressed further. Did you ever see anything that suggested Brennan might have been dangerous? Margaret hesitated. There was one incident, she finally said. I was about 14, so this would have been around 1939. I was in the church helping to arrange flowers for a wedding. Thomas was there, cleaning. I overheard him talking to himself. He was saying strange things about how Father O'Brien was a saint, how he needed to protect him from evil, how the devil was trying to corrupt the church. It frightened me. I told my grandmother and she told Father O'Brien. That's when Thomas was sent to the hospital. When he came back, he seemed better, quieter. But there was something in his eyes, something that made me uncomfortable. I tried to avoid being alone with him after that. This was a potential breakthrough. Chen theorized that Brennan's mental illness might have progressed, that his obsession with Father O'Brien might have turned violent. But what could have triggered such violence? What could have caused a devoted caretaker to murder the priest he supposedly worshipped? Chen needed more evidence. She decided to search the church archives more thoroughly. The current priest, Father James Walsh, gave her full access to the church's historical records, which were stored in boxes in the basement of the rectory. Chen spent days going through old documents, letters, financial records, anything that might provide a clue. And then she found it. A letter dated October 14th, 1941, the day before Father O'Brien disappeared. The letter was addressed to the Bishop of Burlington. It was written in Father O'Brien's handwriting. Chen read it with growing shock. In the letter, Father O'Brien reported that he had discovered something deeply disturbing. Thomas Brennan had been stealing from the church's collection box. Small amounts at first, just a few dollars here and there, but over time it had added up to nearly $200, a significant sum in 1941. More disturbing, Father O'Brien had discovered that Brennan had been using the money to purchase alcohol, which he consumed in secret in his cottage behind the church. But that wasn't the worst part. Father O'Brien wrote that he had confronted Brennan about the theft and the drinking. Brennan had become agitated, even threatening. He had said things that frightened Father O'Brien, things about how the priest didn't understand, how he was being tested by God, how he needed to prove his faith. Father O'Brien wrote that he feared for his safety and was requesting that the bishop remove Brennan from his position and find him help. The letter concluded, "I plan to speak with Thomas again tomorrow morning after Mass to inform him of my decision. I pray that he will accept this with grace, but I fear he may react violently. If anything should happen to me, please know that I tried to help him, but I cannot allow him to remain in a position of trust when he has betrayed that trust so thoroughly." The letter was never sent. Father O'Brien must have written it the night before his disappearance, intending to mail it the next day. But he never got the chance. Chen now had a clear motive. Brennan had been stealing from the church. Father O'Brien had discovered the theft and was going to report him. Brennan, mentally unstable and desperate, had killed Father O'Brien to prevent this from happening, but Chen still needed to prove it. She needed physical evidence linking Brennan to the murder. She returned to the forensic lab and asked them to re-examine the skeleton and the items found with it. Using modern DNA analysis techniques that didn't exist in 1941, the forensic team was able to extract DNA from the bones. They also found something else. On the priest's cassock that had been wrapped around the skeleton, there were microscopic fibers that didn't match the cassock itself. These fibers were analyzed and determined to be from a wool work shirt, the type commonly worn by laborers in the 1940s. Even more significantly, they found a single hair caught in the fabric. The hair was analyzed and a DNA profile was created. Chen now needed a DNA sample from Thomas Brennan to compare. But Brennan had been dead for 45 years. However, Chen learned that Brennan had a living relative, a great-nephew named Robert Brennan who lived in Boston. Chen contacted Robert and explained the situation. Robert agreed to provide a DNA sample. The results came back 2 weeks later. The DNA from the hair found on Father O'Brien's cassock was a familial match to Robert Brennan. The hair had belonged to someone in the Brennan family line. Combined with all the other evidence, the circumstantial case against Thomas Brennan was overwhelming. Chen held a press conference in September 2023 to announce the findings. After 82 years, we can finally say with confidence what happened to Father Thomas O'Brien, she said. He was murdered by Thomas Brennan, the church caretaker, on the night of October 15, 1941. Brennan killed Father O'Brien to prevent him from reporting Brennan's theft and alcoholism to the bishop. Brennan then buried the body beneath the church altar, believing it would never be found. He continued to work at the church for decades, maintaining the grounds, ringing the bells, all while knowing that his victim lay buried beneath the very altar where he had committed his crime. The revelation shocked the nation. How could someone commit such a heinous act and then continue to live and work in the same place, surrounded by people who trusted him for decades? How could he attend Mass every Sunday, knowing what he had done? How could he sleep at night? Psychologists interviewed by the media suggested that Brennan's mental illness likely allowed him to compartmentalize his guilt, perhaps even to convince himself that he had done the right thing, that he had protected himself and the church from scandal. Some suggested that his continued service at the church was a form of penance, a way to atone for his sin without confessing it. The Diocese of Burlington issued a statement expressing profound sorrow for what had happened and pledging to ensure that Father O'Brien received a proper burial. On November 1st, 2023, All Saints' Day, Father Thomas O'Brien was finally laid to rest in the cemetery behind St. Michael's Church. Hundreds of people attended the funeral, including descendants of the families he had served, priests from across Vermont, and even the Bishop of Burlington. Father O'Brien's remains were interred in a place of honor, with a new headstone that read, Father Thomas O'Brien, 1894 to 1941. Faithful servant of God, taken from us too soon, now at peace. The stone altar beneath which Father O'Brien had been buried was removed from the church and replaced with a new altar. The diocese decided that the old altar, tainted by its association with murder, could not remain in a sacred space. It was broken up and buried in an unmarked location. The church itself underwent a ceremony of reconsecration, a ritual cleansing to remove the spiritual stain of the crime that had been committed there. Father Walsh led the ceremony, praying for the soul of Father O'Brien and for healing for the community that had been traumatized by this revelation. The story of Father O'Brien's murder became a national sensation. True crime podcasts devoted episodes to it. Documentary filmmakers came to Ashford to make films about the case. Books were written analyzing the psychology of Thomas Brennan and the circumstances that led to the murder. The church where it happened became a pilgrimage site for true crime enthusiasts, much to the dismay of the current parishioners who simply wanted to worship in peace. But beyond the sensationalism, beyond the media frenzy, there was a deeper truth in this story. It was a story about betrayal, about how someone trusted and relied upon could commit an unspeakable act. It was a story about secrets, about how darkness can hide in plain sight for decades. It was a story about justice delayed but not denied, about how the truth eventually comes to light no matter how deeply it's buried. And it was a story about faith, about a man who dedicated his life to serving God and his community, only to be murdered by someone he had tried to help. Father Thomas O'Brien's story reminds us that evil can wear many faces. It can look like a simple caretaker, a trusted employee, someone who seems harmless and devoted. It reminds us that mental illness, when untreated, can lead to tragedy. It reminds us that small sins, like theft and deception, can escalate into greater evils when left unchecked. And it reminds us that no secret, no matter how carefully guarded, remains hidden forever. The truth has a way of emerging, even after 82 years, even from beneath tons of stone. Today, St. Michael's Church continues to serve the community of Ashford. The congregation has grown, with new families moving to the area, attracted by the beauty of the Vermont mountains and the charm of small-town life. Most of them know the story of Father O'Brien. Some are disturbed by it. Others see it as a reminder of the church's resilience, its ability to survive tragedy and continue its mission. Father Walsh, in his sermons, sometimes speaks about Father O'Brien, honoring his memory and his service. He talks about forgiveness, about how even Thomas Brennan, despite his terrible crime, was a child of God who deserved compassion for his mental illness even as his actions were condemned. The case of Father Thomas O'Brien has been officially closed. The mystery that haunted Ashford for 82 years has been solved, but questions remain. Did anyone else know what Brennan had done? Did he confide in anyone? Did anyone suspect, or did he carry that terrible secret alone for 37 years until his death in 1978? We'll never know for certain. What we do know is that justice, though delayed, was finally served. Father O'Brien's remains were found. His story was told. His memory was honored, and he was finally laid to rest in consecrated ground, surrounded by the community he loved and served. If this story has moved you, if it has made you think about the nature of evil, the importance of mental health treatment, and the resilience of faith communities, leave a comment below. Tell me what you think about this case. Do you believe Thomas Brennan was fully responsible for his actions, or was he a victim of his own mental illness? How do you think the church should have handled the situation differently? Could this tragedy have been prevented? The discussion is open, and I want to hear your thoughts. And remember, when you trust someone, when you rely on them, when you let them into your life, pay attention to the warning signs. Mental illness is real and can be dangerous when untreated. Theft and deception, even in small amounts, are warning signs of deeper problems. And if you see something wrong, speak up. Don't wait. Don't assume someone else will handle it. Father O'Brien wrote that letter asking for help, but he never sent it. If he had sent it the day he wrote it, if the bishop had acted immediately, perhaps he would have lived. Perhaps the tragedy could have been prevented. The bones beneath the altar have finally been laid to rest. But the lessons of this case remain. Evil can hide in sacred places. Secrets can be buried but not forgotten. And justice, no matter how long it takes, will eventually prevail. Rest in peace, Father Thomas O'Brien. Your long wait is over. Your story has been told, and your sacrifice will never be forgotten.